I'm here with Steve Skeels to have an interview with him about Tacoma's vintage motorcycle team and the 24 hours at the ton. This isn't just about speed, it's about Tacoma people, mechanical obsession, friendship, and trying something that most folks would never attempt. Then realizing what it teaches you about endurance, limits, and legacy. So, Steve, how did this idea take shape in the first place?
It came out of a group organized by a fellow named Steve Reddy, where he had put together a team before this one to tackle a land speed record for a very small motorcycle, 100 cc's. And that same group got talking about the 24-hour at a ton, they call it, 24 hours at a speed over 100 miles an hour, that the company Velocette sent back in 1929. And it was coming up on their 50-year anniversary of setting that record. So they got the bright idea that, hey, we can do that too. Of course, they can't use a Velocette motorcycle because there are very few of those still around. And the original record was set by a motorcycle that was prepared by the then still functioning Velocette company. And it was a modified motorcycle, stock. It was advertised as being stock, but it was actually a factory modified motorcycle for this record attempt, and no one knows how it was modified.
So, why Tacoma, Steve? Why this group of people?
Mostly because they lived here.
For people who don't know the history, why is the Velocette record so important?
In 1929, when it was set, to get a vehicle of any type to go 24 hours at a speed over 100 miles an hour was not an easy task. And
I was reading something about the track. It was a wood track. Is that what?
no, it was not a wood track. It was pavement,
Pavement. Okay.
but it was it had a fairly steeply banked corners. It was an oval, and that allowed one to, no matter what vehicle you were using, it allowed you to keep the speed up without falling over with a motorcycle, considering you were on a steep angle and up high on this banking. I think it was around 30 degrees, which is very steep. I've actually been on a track that had a 33-degree banking, and it was difficult to walk up that banking.
So, who were the personalities that made this possible?
It was a fairly large group, although the key people were, of course, Steve Reddy, because he was the money guy, and it was not a cheap endeavor. But we had a couple of very good engine mechanics involved. And then we had a small group of riders who had experience with racing vintage motorcycles, primarily Nortons, but also others. And the speed was not huge. Like modern day motorcycles can go very, very fast, but we're talking at speeds around 100 to maybe 110 to do for a 24-hour event. And these people had that kind of experience, not necessarily with duration racing, but in short sprint racing. But they could do the thing. And we had a number of riders willing to try it so that you could do shifts you'd have to bring the motorcycle in to change riders and fuel, but that's how the original record was set also. There were a number of riders set up to do this.
What surprised you the most about these people?
I don't think I was surprised so much as impressed. And the fact that the mechanics had the due diligence to figure out what they needed and then pursue it. In other words, putting together an engine that was designed to go 100 miles an hour for 24 hours, the engine had to be prepared differently than an engine that was designed to travel in a short duration sprint. And these people had that knowledge and the courage and the dedication to make it happen. The riders, well, we had to have more riders than what they originally had. I think they only had, for the original record, 2 or 3 riders. And we had 2 sort of key riders, the core maybe is a better way to put it, who you had to rely on, but we also had other riders who could give them a break. In other words, they could go for a short duration and give the primary rider a chance to rest and get ready for the next shift. And those were impressive feats.
Let's talk bikes. What made these machines special or challenging?
I'll talk about the challenging part first because we didn't want to pursue this attempt with modern day motorcycles because with today's metallurgy and designs, it would be easy to put together a machine that could tackle this record, but we wanted to tackle it with something that was a challenge and yet wasn't rare and therefore expensive, where we had access to more than one engine. So we had backup engines. And we even put together 2 separate bikes with their own separate group of backup engines so that we could give ourselves the best chance of accomplishing this. And so that was a challenge. And the motorcycle that was selected was a 70s vintage Yamaha 500cc single. And let's see, let me think of what that was. I can't think of what that was. Yamaha, anyway, I'll think of it later. That was the challenge. What was the other thing? What was the challenge? And
Biggest mechanical challenge. What was that?
well, getting a engine prepared that would do 24 hours. Like I said, that has to be different than an engine that was.
What about oil choices, airflow, rider restraint, that type of stuff?
Well, that was less of a challenge. The challenge was creating an engine that would go 24 hours and survive the heat that would build up at 100 miles an hour. And well, it was interesting because they actually had someone in the group, sort of he wasn't participating closely in the design and build. However, he provided a coating. So pistons could be coated with a material that would allow them to shed heat more easily. And cylinders could be coated so that they would absorb that heat more readily and get it to the fins that would then transmit the heat off to the air that was flowing over that engine. And the oil was an easier challenge, but we had to put fairings on this motorcycle to give them an aerodynamic advantage. And that created a different kind of a challenge because it had to be opened up so that it allowed airflow over the engine, because obviously an air-cooled engine needed heat flow, heat transfer. So it had to allow a good mechanism for that to happen.
Was there a moment when you thought this might not happen? I mean, was there that kind of fear in the group at any point in time?
Oh, constantly. We had to test these engines, and the only way we had to test the engine, the bike in general, is to run it at 100 miles an hour. And to do that, we had to have the right track. These motorcycles, here's the model. It was the SR500 street version. Yamaha built several versions, but the SR500 was selected to be the closest we could approximate to the original Velocette model that was used for this record. And in order to test these things, the only way was to run them as long as you could for 100 miles an hour. So we selected a particular track, which was the largest NASCAR track in the States, and then put together a road team that could transport the bikes and spare engines and tools. And we even had enough money involved to fly the riders, the pilots, as it were, to the track. And the track that was selected was in Talladega, Alabama, because it was almost 3 miles in circumference. So it allowed you to get the bikes up to speed and keep them there for as long as possible. And the track provided a nice pit lane, and it provided safety vehicles. So if there was a crash, you actually had somebody with first aid experience to get to you in a hurry. And that was the challenge. That was the solution that was selected. So until we got there and ran the bikes, we really didn't know how they would perform.
What did the 24-hour format teach you that the shorter events never could?
Well, endurance is a factor of riders' endurance and engine and bike endurance. And because we selected this track, which I think that was a good selection, the only problem was it was so far away and it was expensive to rent it. It was so far away that presented an expense because we were flying mechanics and riders and support staff out there. That was all on Steve, and I didn't know how much money Steve had, so me not knowing his finances and wasn't going to probe into that. But I do know that each event, by the time we got to the track, that was over $200,000. And we did this twice. We did the same thing down at a Nevada track by Las Vegas, but it wasn't as satisfying because the track was nowhere near as long as the one in Talladega. I don't remember how long the Nevada one was. So there were 3 separate events where Steve flew all these people I transported in my trailer and truck the motorcycles and the tools and the riding gear for the pilots and so forth, but I didn't care. I liked it. He paid for gas and oil and that stuff for my trips, but that was always a worry, is how many times did we need to do this before we actually tackled the record? And it didn't pan out because for several reasons. Do you want me to go into that now?
Yeah, let's hear the full story.
Well, it didn't work because the two trips to Talladega resulted in riders that could ride the distance, but engines that could get nowhere near the duration. They seized. So when we took these trips, we went with the motorcycles, which were prepared very well. There was not much to that. You just had to have a rolling rig that could go 24 hours, and the bearings and the lubrications and stuff for the chassis were just fine. But the engines were prepared. We learned later that the guy who did the engine work did not follow the instructions. He was told to do them with clearances, and by that I mean it's the space that was allowed between the cylinder walls and the pistons of so many thousandths. I don't remember what it was, 10 thousandths maybe? And that was a fairly large gap in order to allow the pistons to travel in the cylinders without creating as much friction as when they were prepared for a sprint race, much lower duration. And this guy was used to preparing engines for sprint races. And instead of following the instructions, he used clearances that were suitable for a sprint version of that engine. As a consequence, all the engines seized because they had too much heat going on. They couldn't dissipate the heat, and so they all seized.
That must have been extremely disappointing to find out about it way afterwards.
Yes, it was. And I don't know what the financial picture was. I don't think Steve was ready to quit. But unfortunately, Steve had a developing brain tumor and he had to stop. And then Steve passed away in a short order, and that was a tragic loss.
You don't ride much anymore. Why does this story still matter to you?
It was a significant, enjoyable part of my life. Getting to know these people and their dedication and watch this all take place was a really delightful event in my life that I'll never forget for that reason. Plus, my vehicle was perfect at the time, so I was transporting using a 1-ton Dodge diesel pickup and a toy hauler with a big capacity for everything. And I enjoyed the road trips. I always had co-drivers, so we did these trips rather quickly, driving straight through, only stopping to rest in rest stops. And it only took us 2 days, maybe 3, to get from Tacoma to Talladega, Alabama, which is right next to Birmingham. And I enjoyed those trips. The last trip we took, the co-driver and I had an opportunity to stop along the way and visit the Rocket Museum in Huntsville, Alabama. And that was a very unique and enjoyable experience. Also, in Talladega, we were real close to a big, famous motorcycle museum called the Barber Vintage Motorcycle Museum and Track. And Steve bought his tickets to the museum and track on weekends that were rather large events. So the whole group got to go to these big events. at the Barber motorcycle event. And that was real special as well. So the whole thing was a dream vacation, really. It was disappointing that the engines didn't live up to expectations, but the whole experience, running around with these people that were dedicated to this task, and then these ancillary events that we were able to go and see, it was really special.
What do you hope survives from this story?
Say that again?
What do you hope survives from this story? What is the legacy that you see?
Well, it was a disappointing and tragic legacy related to Steve Reddy's situation, but to be part of this group and collaborate was real special for me. And I was able to bring some of my skills to bear in that, well, for instance, the fairing on these motorcycles were covered with decals. They put a really good paint job on these two motorcycles. Steve spent money and had a famous motorcycle race car painter in, what was that? Where was he? He was not in Tacoma. He was around Tacoma somewhere. I think he was close to Lacey, actually, near Olympia. But he had the painter do the fairings, and a very good job. And then everyone who contributed anything, and there were a lot of people that contributed parts and pieces and the paint job, the coatings and everything, had decals, which I created a 2014 logo decal to put on these things in various sizes, using my skills with computers and design packages and a printer that was able to print onto decal paper. And then I was able to take these decals down with water and a sponge and everything and apply them. And then I sprayed them with a clear coat to protect them from wear and tear. wear and tear. And so that was kind of special. And then when the event happened, I created using 4 clipboards, I created timing sheets for the 2 motorcycles. We actually had some of the wives there to record the timings for each lap for the motorcycles. And we actually had a timer package on it that had to be set up right. I wasn't responsible for that part, but I had the wireless readouts for each lap from that timing package that the wives can use to record onto these sheets for each lap. But I also had to have a manual timer system with stopwatches so that we had backups for that electronic timing system. And I was the person that had to create that sort of by default, because I just was looked to for any technology stuff. I had became acquired and was responsible for walkie-talkies and a clock that people could look at, and just miscellaneous stuff on the event. So, but at the end of it, when it was all over, I had cameras that videotaped particular things, including planning meetings where we had everybody in my house around my table planning the whole thing with Steve and his cohorts. And I put together, I think with your help, I'm not sure, a video at the end that was a collage of the entire thing, including videos of the bikes on the tracks, videos of planning sessions, and incorporating all this stuff even into a photograph at the end that was just a collage on oversized paper that we could frame and distribute along with pictures of the motorcycles that I had done in a massively cool and professional way, if I do say so myself. Inside, one of the mechanics had was leasing a hangar at the Gig Harbor Airport, and I was actually able to wet the flooring and put in fancy lighting to get the perfect picture of the motorcycles, and then create a whole bunch of copies that we could again give out to all the participants after the end. And then for Steve Reddy's memorial service, we were able to present this video that was a tribute to the whole team's efforts. So those created lasting impressions. I don't know how great, but I certainly appreciate what I've ended up with out of that.
What does this say about Tacoma that outsiders might miss?
Well, Tacoma has a chapter of it's sort of an unrecognized chapter of the vintage motorcycle enthusiasts group. And that's actually headquartered in Seattle. But there's a very active, enthusiastic group that sort of tagged on to that. And they called themselves a chapter, although the Seattle group won't recognize it as an official chapter. But that's speaking to politics and pride, not really effect. Nonetheless, we've had this Tacoma chapter, and they have their own leadership, and they're very active. They're still active. And there was a time period, several time periods, when the Seattle group almost disbanded, but the Tacoma was alive and well throughout. And the Tacoma group does what's known as the,
The Vashon Isle?
Yes, the Vasson, let's see if I can think of it.
BME?
Tour de Vashon is what they label it. And once a year, around New Year's in January, they do this thing where it's, there's a name for it. There's a particular ride around Vashon Island. There's a big ending group in a particular park, and there's judging for vintage motorcycles and so forth. And it's pretty popular, and that keeps going. But that has nothing to do with the 24T project. The 24T project was totally independent and a brainchild and sponsored and paid for by Steve Reddy.
Why is it so important to tell your story now?
Because you want me to.
If someone watching this has their own impossible idea, what would you tell them?
Well, you have to start with the right sponsorship and a person willing to fund it. And we were fortunate to have Steve Reddy. After that, it's just having the built-in enthusiasm that comes from having the right people involved. You have to have the planners, you have to have the support staff, you have to have the right people to transport to make that happen. You have to have the right people to build the mechanics, to build the engine. It's no less involved than putting a Formula One car on a track somewhere in the world. It's just probably less expensive. But the details of that effort are no less important to make it happen.
So do you think this is special to Tacoma?
I think it just was lucky to be involved because we had the right groups in each one of those categories. The writers, the planners, the money guy, and the engine builder, although he didn't do it right, he was still a qualified individual. And then the mechanics that did the work on the motorcycles beyond the engine work.